Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I am here today visiting the Hunting Museum in Stokkseyri on the south coast of Iceland, just about an hour east of Reykjavik. And we're taking a look at the firearms history of Iceland. Now, from a military perspective, Iceland is a nearly unique country in that over its more than 1,000-year history, well, 1,200-year history, it's never actually had a military force. Outside of today, there's a little bit of Coast Guard activity, but there has never been an Icelandic army. That's actually something that they take quite a lot of pride in. But there have been firearms on Iceland. In fact, there have been firearms on Iceland for a very long time. One of the really interesting things about Icelandic culture in general is their appreciation for written records and literacy. And this dates all the way back to the very first settlements of the Viking era. And in particular, the unique government of Iceland, the fact that this was originally a commonwealth, there was never a king, there was never a single authority ruling over the island, there really wasn't an aristocracy. Well, most of the documents that we have from the pre-Christian era or early Christian eras, in most countries, they're talking about kings and priests. Well, there weren't so much of those in Iceland, and so the documents in Iceland record the ordinary day-to-day goings-on of regular common folk, which gives us a fantastic insight into what life was like in Iceland for hundreds of years in the past. And in particular, it gives us an idea of when firearms first showed up in Iceland. In a typical medieval country, you would expect perhaps the first documentation is when some, a king or a bishop or a high official commissioned some fancy firearm. Well, and that doesn't really tell you when did the regular people have them. Well, here in Iceland, there is a written record as far back as 1482 describing a dispute between two farmers over a firearm. So we know that firearms existed here that far back. There's further documentation from 1548 and 1550 describing firearms in the possession of one of the Christian bishops. And then the first gunsmith, I should say, the first written record of hunting of animals on Iceland is specifically hunting of a polar bear like that guy from the year 1615. Now, it's important to note that polar bears are not native to Iceland. In fact, when the first Vikings arrived, there was really only one land-based mammal on Iceland, and it was the Arctic fox. There were no large game. And so there's never really been that much call for hunting rifles on the island. Back in the 1700s, reindeer were actually imported and introduced from Norway specifically for hunting. But polar bears, like that guy, occasionally float over to Iceland on icebergs, ice floes from Greenland. And they get here quite hungry and are generally immediately shot as soon as they are found. And like I said, the first record of that is as early as 1615. Now, during that period, these firearms are being imported from Europe. The first gunsmith appears in the records in the 1730s or 1740s on the island, working on firearms. The manufacture of firearms on Iceland has been very limited and dates originally to the 1800s. So there are three gunsmiths of particular note in Iceland, guys who are actually manufacturing firearms. There's never been industrial production. There's never been a gun factory here, or even really so much as a mass production gun workshop on Iceland. There simply wasn't enough demand. Most of the guns that were used on the island were simply imported from Norway, from Denmark, from elsewhere in Europe. But like I said, there are three gunsmiths that stand out as having produced guns on the island domestically. The first of these is Josef Johansson, who around 1890 manufactured a number of actually pretty darn large shotguns, things that range from 4-bore to 8-bore. It's not known exactly how many he made, probably not very many, and he was located in the north of Iceland, outside the city of Akureyri, which today is the second largest city on the island. Following him was a gunsmith named Jon Thorsteinsson, also located in the north in Ólafsfjörður, which is very close to Akureyri. And he lived between 1890, died in 1968, and he manufactured, again, a kind of unknown number of single-shot break-action shotguns. And we actually have one of his guns right here. And these were manufactured in a variety of sizes, from the petite small 12 gauge all the way up to 4-bore or 4 gauge. They're a simplified break-action gun, and we'll take a closer look at one of those in a moment. It's thought that in total he probably made, well, I think about 30 of them are known. How many more than that he made is unclear, but again, not a really large number. Finally, we have the most prolific firearms manufacturing gunsmith in Iceland, and that was a gentleman by the name of Einar Bjarnason. He was born in 1907 and lived until 1991. So at this point, we're talking really fairly recent history. Bjarnason was really kind of this inveterate tinkerer, inventor sort of person that we often see connected with firearms development and small-scale firearms manufacture. So he made and designed lots of things: washing machines, musical instruments. He made himself a violin, hand tools, powered tools. This is a sort of occupation that's really important when you're in what is essentially a very frontier sort of location. There's not, Iceland, especially 50 years ago, was a pretty poor place. There wasn't a lot of raw material to work with. There's not a lot of economic development. There's very little industrial development on the island at that point. And if you want something, making it yourself is often one of the best ways to get it. So Bjarnason does that and decides to start making shotguns. He had been a gunsmith, he'd worked on them, and decided to start making his own, starting in 1977. So he was 70 years old when he started doing these guns. He would manufacture a total of 120 guns. They start at serial number 101 and go up to 220. And they are essentially a copy of the Marlin goose gun. And we have one of those here, and we have a second one also to take a look at that is a very rare variation. Now, he named this the Drífa, or in plural, Drífur, and it's interesting, and it's a gun that has fantastic Icelandic history, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a really well-crafted gun. The materials for these shotguns were largely, I wouldn't say scavenged or salvaged, but not the typical sort of sources for firearms making that you would normally expect. So, for example, we actually have the beginnings of another gun here. He was still making these when he died. The barrels were made from an axle shaft that was imported from outside the country, which he then drilled out to a 12-gauge bore diameter. The bolts were manufactured from boat propeller shaft. It's good steel, very strong, tough steel in order to work as a propeller shaft. He was able to gather up that material and repurpose it to make a bolt. And like I said, these are a copy of the Marlin goose gun, so they're a bolt-action shotgun. The standard design was simply a single-shot gun. He made 5 of them that used box magazines, and we'll take a look at one of those in a moment. He made one that had an internal magazine for a second shell, so it was a one in the chamber, one in the magazine sort of deal. And I can really understand how, having done one of those, he decided that the complexity of having to feed a second round wasn't worth having just one extra round. So anyway, let's take a step back and let's take a look at one of these break-action shotguns, and then let's take a closer look at the Drífa. So this is an example from Jon Thorsteinsson. So this is he was alive between 1880 and 1968. And this is going to date to probably about the World War II era. It is a very simple underlever single-shot shotgun. What we have here is sort of the classic cocking lever. This is not intended to be a hammer itself. This was a common thing that was done after percussion guns were superseded by cartridges. You'd still have a cocking lever here for cocking and decocking the gun. Now, to open this, we just take the lever and rotate it out 90 degrees, and then the gun breaks open like so. And it's actually a very simple action. Looking inside here, you can see this T-shaped slot in the barrel. The lever is connected to a matching T-shaped lug. And this isn't spring-loaded, and it simply rotates 360 degrees. So when it's perpendicular to the barrel can close. And when you then rotate it back under the trigger guard, that T-shaped lug has now locked the barrel in the downward position. And it's ready to fire as soon as you actually cock it. Now, it's also interesting to take a look at the back of the chamber here. Notice that there is, in fact, no extractor. That is going to dramatically simplify the process of manufacturing the gun, to not have to make some sort of moving extractor mechanism in there. Instead, you are provided with basically a small sort of fishing weight, and after firing a shell, you would simply open up the breech of the gun, tip the barrel upward, drop a weight down the muzzle, and it would hit the base of the shell and knock the shell out. The stock is sort of an older style with the rounded butt, sort of semi-pistol grip. This is something that you would see very commonly in Europe and North America, and more like the mid-late 1800s. On shotguns, I'm thinking in particular of the Spencer shotguns, have a grip and buttstock style very similar to this. The rear sight is a rounded V notch, and then way out here on the end of the barrel is a bead. Now, some of these were blued. This particular one was never blued. Instead, it was simply lacquered. So again, we're talking about economizing the production. Make this something that's relatively simple that can be made on Iceland before there's a lot of formal resources for doing this sort of work. So in total, 30, maybe a few more than that, manufactured. We have a second example. This is probably an earlier model. It is actually serialized. Some of them were. This is number 115. Serial numbers on these started at 100. He didn't think that anyone would buy serial number 1, which, okay, I can understand that. This one is actually a bit different in design in that here, instead of having a fully internal hammer system, we have the firing pin right there exposed, and it is directly hit by the hammer here on the outside. Also, that hammer is mounted on essentially a lock plate behind the receiver, where the later guns, this was moved up onto the receiver. You can simplify it quite a bit by getting rid of this component entirely. So once again, we have a under lever brake action. You can see the T block right there, works the same way. This is still a design with no extractor and just a simple fixed rear notch sight there. And of course, this one is blued. The later guns, again, simplifying the process, instead of being blued, they were simply lacquered. A few little interesting decorative elements here. But that is Bjarnason's gun. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the Drífa. So here we have the standard pattern of Drífa. It's a single shot gun. It is bolt action. And of course, if you've seen some of the bolt action shotguns like the Marlin Goose gun, this should look fairly reasonably familiar. If we take a look at the receiver here, we actually have markings. They're hand-stamped markings, but we have JB here for Jon Bjarnason, the manufacturer's initials. Dalvik is the town that he lived in. Drífa is the name of the gun, the model name, you would say. Serial number here, this is number 144, and 3-inch Magnum. So these are all the Drífur are 12-gauge guns with 3-inch chambers. There is a safety on the back here that simply blocks operation of the trigger. And then in the forward position, you can fire. Now, the firing pins have been removed from the two examples we're looking at today because they are guns that are out on display. So to meet Icelandic law in that way, they do need to be disabled with the firing pins removed. The interesting thing here to me is, again, there is a lot of simplicity built into the design of these guns to make them more feasible to manufacture. So the bolt handle opens, but you can't actually open it all the way. You can only bring it back this far. That is where, well, the bolt hits the sear. So to actually cycle the bolt, you have to pull the trigger, which then allows you to pull the bolt back. And if you release the trigger, the bolt's going to stop at this position, which allows you to drop a shell in, close the bolt. The striker is going to be recocked upon action of closing the bolt, and then you can fire another shot. If you want to disassemble the gun, the procedure is exactly the same. You just hold the trigger back a little bit longer until the bolt comes out the back. So there's the sear right there. Very simple trigger. It simply lowers the sear. It's actually just one piece there. The sear is directly connected to the trigger itself. Unlike the earlier guns, we do have extractors. We actually have dual extractors here. We have a slot for an ejector, and then the bolt handle rotates freely on the bolt body. So when you reassemble this, you just have to kind of line everything up line up the extractor slot or the ejector slot, line up the bolt handle with the slot in the receiver. Some interesting texturing on the back of the bolt there. And normally this is where your firing pin would be, running through the length. And that's pretty much all there is to it. You can see right here, when the gun is in battery, this lines up just like this. So the first thing that happens when you open the bolt handle is it's going to lever the firing pin back, like so. Start the process of recocking the firing pin. That's going to, like if you have a dud or a round that doesn't fire, that's going to ensure that the firing pin has retracted back before you start moving the bolt open. So that's actually a safety mechanism built in. And this is, in fact, the only locking surface. It's just the bolt stem that locks the gun closed. And for a 12-gauge shotgun, that's just fine. The receiver is very simple tube. The sights are just a V-notch in the back. A very long barrel for clearly optimized for bird hunting, and a bead at the front. Now, I mentioned that there were a couple special models. So of the 120 guns, 114 of them were of this pattern. There was one made that had an internal magazine that would hold a second cartridge. Like I said, understandable why you would only do that once. And then there were 5 made that actually used magazines. These are Stevens magazines that were imported from the United States. A little sticky in there. That holds all of 2 rounds. So this is a 2+1 capacity. Because of course in most places, bird hunting law limits the magazine to 3 rounds. This dramatically simplifies the work of making a repeating shotgun, because this sort of magazine is going to give you feed lips. It's going to give you the proper spring tensioning on the magazine, on the cartridges in the magazine. It's going to give you follower stops. Like, this makes things way simpler. So what Bjarnason did is buy 8 of these magazines from Stevens in the US. Built 3 of the guns were sold with a single magazine. 2 of them were sold with 2 magazines, and 1 of the magazines was actually never used. So that's the sum total. It's neat with small manufacture like this that's well documented that we can know things to that level of detail. So if we look at these two, you can see the basic design is the same, just the trigger guard here has been expanded forward to act as a magazine holder. Wood's fairly, like, there's no finish on the wood on the inside of the magazine well. The bolt functions exactly the same. So if I try to open this, it will only open this far until I pull the trigger to allow the bolt to come back farther, go that far, and then you can actually cycle a second round into the chamber, and there's a very basic magazine catch right there. So materials for these, like I said, the barrels came from axle stock that was drilled out. The bolts were made out of salvaged propeller shaft, and then he salvaged metal from a lot of other sources, things that were around, old farm equipment. There was I guess there was a sort of sled that was commonly used. It's kind of like the Icelandic snow version of a kid's scooter. And he snapped up a few of those and used things like metal from the runners on those for parts of the shotguns, and achieved a grand total production of 120 guns between 1977 and 1990. So one other thing that I think is worth commenting on is the finish here. It's actually really quite nicely blued, which is something that might be surprising for a gun with this sort of provenance. Well, this being, of course, the days well before the internet, the way that they figured out how to do the bluing was Jon's uncle in Öræfi, who was a teacher, wrote a letter to Guns and Ammo magazine in the United States. The magazine had a Q&A column, and he wrote in and basically said, I'm trying to blue some shotguns. Can you help me out with how to do that? And they answered the letter and gave him the formula and the materials necessary to make that sort of, to do that sort of finishing. So they actually didn't quite get the formula correct, but good enough that the result was really a pretty nice blued finish on the guns. One of the really cool things about the Drífa, Bjarnason's shotgun here, is they're all actually accounted for. 120 were made, 120 remain in private hands on Iceland. There is actually an owners club or association of owners of these shotguns. And about 15 or 20 years ago, a few enthusiasts started looking into where they all were, knowing the location of a couple dozen at that time, and they were actually able to locate literally every single one of them. It's really a pretty cool example of an interest in something that is domestic. Like, there's no way that this is the best shotgun out there. It's not a prestigious gun mechanically, but it is really cool to have that connection to the local Icelandic manufacturer. Oh, and it's kind of funny, Bjarnason was sort of the classic cranky gunsmith old man by the time he was making these guns. He'd make 2 of them at a time, and he had a waiting list of customers who wanted them. And apparently, when he finished 2, he'd just go to the list and take the top 2 names and give those people a phone call. This is, of course, well before the era of cell phones. And apparently, if you didn't answer the phone when he called, too bad, you lose your spot. And he'd just move down the list until someone answered the phone. Probably much to the disappointment of anyone who missed their chance at one, because these were not made quickly. 120 over the course of 13 years. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this look at a very cool, very small corner of firearms history. A big thanks to the Hunting Museum for giving me the opportunity to come here and pull these guns off of the display and show them to you. Thanks for watching.